This is Our Faculty, the VCU School of Medicine podcast series from the Office of Faculty Affairs. I'm your host, Katherine Henderson, and I'm here to introduce you to interesting people at VCU, their projects, and their perspectives. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Kevin Harris, the inaugural Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the VCU School of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Harris.
Hi, how are you, Catherine? Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you.
Yes, we are so glad to have you here. So your role is new, but also very vital for our school. Will you take a few minutes to tell us about yourself and your role here?
Absolutely happy to. And I'd start by just reiterating that I agree with you that the timing and the opportunity that's before us now, particularly coming off of the type of year that we all have experienced, this is a vital time for us. This opportunity is coming at a point where we have to focus on moving the agenda forward with respect to creating an inclusive work and learning environment. So how did I get here? A little bit about myself, and I'll certainly not take the scenic route. From a little small town south of here, about an hour south of here, Emporia. And quite frankly, diversity in my experience, certainly as a young child coming up and as a young man developing, was really focused around race. Really, in my small town, based on the demographics, it really was a classic black and white issue. I certainly got more exposure and understood that there was a bigger world out there as I went off to college, and even probably more so as I went off into the National Guard. I had an 8-year stint with our Virginia National Guard and had a chance to just go out in different parts of the country that certainly I had never seen before and engage people in terms of a sense of diversity that I'd never engaged before. And so my views began to take shape in a broader sense. It wasn't until I entered my role at the AAMC in and around 1992-93, where I began to get language for something that I always felt was a part of me. And that was, again, I didn't call it diversity, but I always had this yearning and this interest in engaging folk and understanding people, understanding their stories. So that was just a part of who I am. I was that person that had friends, all from different spectrums. Even, those who may not have engaged each other or considered each other's friends were my friends because I met people where they were. And again, I just didn't know what that was. I certainly wasn't calling that diversity. And I certainly didn't understand at the time that diversity was a field that you could really pursue. So at the AAMC, I began to get language. I began to get concepts. I began to get those experiences where I could then attach my lived experiences and understandings to those for the benefit of development programs and other initiatives. And that work over 13 years or so led to my coming to VCU, really as an extension of that work to help to revive some work we had done previously around our health workforce pipeline. And we were able to develop that work to get a model stood up that we're very proud of that still exists today. And then to build an office. I was the inaugural director of Division for Health Sciences Diversity Office, which then housed that work. So for the first 4 years or so of my tenure at VCU, it was focused on building that project out. Of course, as well as working with other colleagues in areas of research, training grants. We're also building capacity around that as well. So that was the center of my work until I began to get engaged in some broader opportunities around community engagement and working with partners on our Monroe Park campus, Kathy Howard and others in our Division for Community Engagement. And then beginning to, again, as I advanced up in terms of responsibilities, working more at a strategic level with a number of offices across both campuses. So that's been, sort of the role that I played. It was sort of strategic program development, policy development, and review, community engagement. Those were the areas in which I spent my time. The opportunity to come to the School of Medicine, quite frankly, occurred in the summer of 2020, following the killing of George Floyd and all that brought on in terms of the national response, social unrest at every turn. And certainly within our city of Richmond, and certainly even within our university. And the university at that same time trying to process also the history that was being uncovered around acts in our past, particularly in our healthcare practice, that was discriminatory and certainly not something that we're proud of. And so as that began to emerge and the grappling with that, it was a recognition really brought on largely by our learners, and their colleagues in the other schools that brought about an urgency that now is the ideal time, really the required time for us to truly engage this DEI work in an authentic and meaningful way. That led to my involvement in some initiatives that we tried to launch to address the urgency that was being brought to our attention and that we understood as leaders as well. And that led to my having an interim role in working with the School of Medicine and building out some of its diversity infrastructure, and ultimately realizing for myself that this is really where I belong. And this reminded me of why I do this work, why this work is important to me. And fortunately, I've been given an opportunity with this new role to actually have an impact and contribute.
That's an amazing path that you've taken to arrive here. And you described your kind of natural inclination to diversity and inclusion, and how your work at the AAMC and the VCU have kind of guided your past experience and led you here. Now, similarly, VCU it has a history, so to speak, and that should be acknowledged. Will you speak to that for a bit?
Absolutely. And this is a timely question. I would, just to frame it a bit differently, certainly acknowledging our history is important. It's a necessary component. But I would further expand that to say it's acknowledging, but then also embracing to some extent, owning it, if you will, maybe a better word, confronting it, because there certainly are those aspects that I talked about earlier that does not speak well of who we were at that time. And some pieces of that still sort of exist throughout our DNA now. But more importantly, it's engaging it. And that's the piece where I think the DEI project has value. You certainly want to acknowledge and embrace and confront. And from that, we can start to talk about the lessons learned, right? You have to kind of get an intimate view of our history to start teasing out the lessons learned. And we've already, we're not the VCU of the past. We're not the MCV of the past. And so not to suggest that, but there's still lessons that can be learned from that period of what either not to do or what to even look for that might still, I call it, have some residue from our history that still informs and impacts who we are now. So it forces us to do that interrogation. But we don't want to stay there, right? We want to take that information about ourselves and then leverage it in terms of who we are aspiring to be and who we are now. So what I mean by that, how does this history, as it shaped who we are, inform how we now train our learners? How does this history has shaped who we are inform how we might approach our research or how we might engage our community in some different ways, in some more authentic ways, in some more sustainable ways, right? So we look at that history, we say, wow, this isn't good in some cases, right? And I don't want to say all of who VCU and MCV was in our past had no benefit, right? That's just not accurate. But there was enough of an appetite toward some of the things of that time that were not acceptable from a inclusivity or even just a humanity piece, that those areas that we want to really scrub those out, but replace them with lessons that move us forward. How now do we become more inclusive? How now do we create an environment that creates more of a sense of belonging for everyone? Everyone has a voice. Everyone matters, right? So that's what it is. And so just to briefly mention, I had the pleasure of working with colleagues Cheryl Garland and Logan Vetrovic and Ann Massey, who are dear colleagues. We worked together to build a health equity initiative, which we just celebrated the 5-year mark. But we've also ventured off now into developing a history in health project that tries to do exactly what I just described. It creates a place where the institution and individuals can begin to understand our history, put it in its context, and then from that, learn how do we then leverage that into training modalities, into different ways of teaching, different ways of practicing medicine, so forth and so on. And so we had a pilot run just last semester, and we got some great feedback, and we are excited to move forward. So there's action in place to say, let's place this history in its context. Let's learn from it. but then let's grow. I tend to say in that regard, and I'll close with this, our history rightfully, it shapes us. It just does. We can't get around it. But it is not something that should confine or define who we are moving forward. And that's kind of the centerpiece I use when I think about the importance of our history in our current context.
I really like that concept of history not confining or defining who we are moving forward, and the idea of taking lessons from the past as we move forward into a more just and inclusive future. Can you
Yes.
tell us some of the current steps that you've led the school in taking in that regard?
Yes. And coming into, and I'll use my interim role as a starting point. One of the things that going into an organization where there's currently no office to think about this work, you inherently or you immediately understand that there are likely not structures in place, or if there's structures in place to carry the work forward, they may not be as connected as they needed to be. So the first thought in working with Dean Buckley was to begin to look at what structures are needed to, one, introduce the DEI work, to begin to socialize it within the School of Medicine, but then looking forward to how do you sustain it. And that was an important step because what we know and knew then and know now is that at some point we were going to move past the social unrest at the level that it was last summer. We're going to at some point move past the issues presented to us by COVID, right? Our finances should revive itself, right? And get back to a place where we feel more sure-footed about what we want to do in that space. And so with that, we understood that historically, the DEI work starts to take a back seat. And these are particularly in institutions where the work is still in an emergent state, if you will. You know, new people, new faces, new expertise just coming on board. So we wanted to build in structures, with meaning looking at colleagues who need to be activated and engaged, and I call it pulled off the bench. We wanted to set up a council that is representative across the school and a place where we can bring our ideas, our concerns, and then have them vetted and researched and then create a position to be more action-oriented that we then can bring to our executive leadership. And that's we ended up with our Inclusion Council, who is well on its way to serving that role. We wanted to first make sure that we had a strong and inclusive and robust diversity statement. And I would even point to that as quite frankly, the most important work that was done throughout that entire period. And some might say, are you serious? A diversity statement's most important? The answer is yes, because in that statement and the way it was developed with consensus and buy-in and people investing in it, we now have a public expression of who we say we are in this space. And it essentially gives us the metrics by which we begin to evaluate ourselves. And it helps to hold us accountable because we as a community said, this is who we aspire to be. And so that is something that, again, if you think about the preamble to our Constitution, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or our Declaration of Independence, those kinds of statements give the institution a framework for getting the work done. So that was an important piece. We began to look at commemorative artifacts from our Confederate period and how do we recast and reshape and rename some of those spaces and places. Beginning to look at things such as legacy checkboxes in our medical school application, which many believe to have had an impact on admissions of individuals who at one point didn't have an opportunity to create a legacy, right? And so those kinds of things were moved on by Dr. Buckley and others. Our first a lecture from Dr. Jeffrey Young at the AAMC around DEI. Just a number of hosts of things. And now more currently, we're looking at a partnership with UVA and a model that they call Stepping In, which really allows us to develop skill sets around addressing discrimination and bias in the workplace, in the clinical setting, real time. So these are just wonderful opportunities that we've been able to work toward in just a very short period. And I'd end by saying what's important to sustaining this work is now the shift in the number of individuals who have a formal DEI position. So now each of our health sciences schools has, appointed by the dean or in a formal role, have responsibility for working with the school on DEI initiatives. And then we have our health system with Dr. Marcel Davis, herself an inaugural director of diversity. We have the Massey Cancer Center in the midst of hiring their inaugural director of diversity. So I tend to say we have a very deep bench now, and we've kind of shifted the ecology a bit. And so once we get our footing as a collective in this DEI space, I think the opportunities to make this work integral to who we are and a part of our excellence, there's no limits to it. We certainly have the players now around the table to get this done.
So with that in mind, how do you envision VCU's future progress in this area?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, but also a hint of realism. And with both of those qualities, I still find us in a position of excellence, full stop. I know VCU has the capacity to be a national leader in this space. I know it. And so we can do some things that other institutions can't do just by the capacities we have. We are a comprehensive medical school. We have the trauma center. We have a thriving health system that has recognition across the state, a cancer center, an Office of Inclusive Excellence that is doing some tremendous and innovative work. So when you look at all of those assets that are in place, and then the community in which we sit that is vibrant and full of history, I think that we're poised to actually get this right. And being in the heart of the confederacy. This is ground zero for some of what the DEI project is asked to address. There's a quote that says, "Healing begins where the wound was made," by Alice Walker. And that quote essentially says that in the place where some of what we now find unacceptable, that's the place where you begin to actually heal at its root. And that's where I think we're positioned. And not to mention that we're also in that Commonwealth's capital. And so we have ready access to our governmental, our public sector. So again, I feel that we're on a path to excellence. What it's going to take, though, is a continued investment in this work. And I'm not just talking about financial investment, although that's going to be important too, but a personal investment. Everyone's going to have to sort of roll their sleeves up and put skin in this game, right? This is not, this position, this office is not the end all and be all for diversity. In fact, that has been the guaranteed failure of this work, is when an organization begins to think that, oh, that's the diversity's office work. Oh, that's for them to do. No, this is all hands on deck. If we can get individuals and colleagues and learners to understand that we are all in this together, that we all are in fact accountable for this work, then what that allows me to do in my role and with my background and expertise is to begin, yes, to certainly address issues that might create some challenges for us, but even more importantly, help to innovate in this space, right? To help connect this work to the mission and the vision that the school is setting and that they have in front of them. So that's kind of why I think I'm so positive toward us really achieving a level of excellence that, again, I do think will be nationally recognized. That is a part of personally of what I would want to see. And I know the institution would want to see that we not only benefit ourselves, but we're able to even inform the discourse around diversity, equity, and inclusion at a national level, but focus on the good work that we're doing here. So that's where I really see and envision this work going. And some of the tangible steps, again, is going to go back to taking our time and being disciplined to build sustainable structures so that we're not building programs on top of faulty foundations and people don't understand why those programs have relevance. We're doing a lot of things, but we're not sort of having impact. So making sure that we're focusing keenly on culture and people's experience and paying attention to areas in which people feel they don't belong or they don't matter, that there's not trust, looking at those aspects as well. A person's experience here is going to be an integral part of us having any modicum of success. And then we'll be in a position to then have some programming that amplifies what we already have in our culture. See, that's the challenge with some diversity work, is that it typically starts with programs. We want to see a lot of events and lectures and we want to have, trainings and so forth, but we haven't done the groundwork to make sure that it sits upon a relevant space. And then what tends to happen is that those programs are at some point deemed to be ineffective, but it's ineffective because it wasn't positioned based upon what the need was. And that need only comes from people being engaged and appreciating both their individual and our collective accountability in this space. So that's the goal. That's the model. Build sufficient structures, pay attention to the culture, and then have some intentionality around developing some programming and some training that helps to amplify and elevate and not necessarily always fix and repair. That's the formula in its simplest terms.
So if our colleagues want to grow and improve, what actions would you suggest they take?
There's very little you can do in an academic medical center that won't involve or impact or influence faculty, right? So they are critical just by the nature of who they are and what they do. But what I would recommend in terms of them getting engaged in this work, first is just kind of taking stock internally. Ask yourself the question, how does diversity show up with me in my personal space now? What are my notions and ideas, and even I'd say concerns about diversity, right? What is my current level of engagement? You have to do some self-reflection and self-assessment first, and just kind of make sure that you're coming to this space with a clear understanding of where your strengths are and where there might be some blind spots, right? And then once you begin to do that individual work and begin to have it show up, this is conversation you would want to have. You'd want to have this be a part of your day-to-day thinking, looking at your research labs. How is diversity impacting what we're doing? How are voices being heard or not heard? How are we factoring in the needs of our surrounding community, even though we're sitting right here at a bench with research in front of us? If you're teaching, you certainly can't get away from understanding not just local, but global context in which your work is being taught and how learners are influenced by their own personal lived experience. So those are the things that you have to do for self-assessment. And then the next piece is getting engaged. You have to activate. This doesn't require you being where you need to be. I've kind of often heard people say, well, this is not my wheelhouse, or I don't have this lived experience. And what I would say to faculty that, as I said before, this is all hands on deck. And quite honestly, if there's nothing else that's received or taken away from this conversation, I'd really want to impress upon all of us the point that there's no null state in diversity. And what I mean by that, there's no issue or person that's diverse. And then there are others who are not diverse. We all bring a lived experience that matters. That's the message that I hope begins to recast what we feel about diversity, that diversity is a other. No, diversity is you, every one of us. We all bring a richness to this table that we uniquely have crafted over time. And we are expected or required to then offer that up into the community, whether it be teaching, learning, research, patient care, whatever your setting is, to authentically bring your experiences to the table because they matter. They're not it only matters if you're from this demographic or that demographic or from that background. Diversity matters, period, full stop. So I would say come from that lens and say, okay, yes, I have lived experience that I can add to the marketplace to help enrich who we are. And then what that begins to do is to set the environment, a culture of appreciation for diversity. Because now we don't see it as this sort of transactional thing or this segmented thing that only a few people have. So that engagement starts to do that. And you can do it as you're developing your own awareness about yourself. And then get active, be intentional. So if there is a project that's being launched, let's see how you might want to take the work that you do and connect it to that project. If there's a committee being formed, maybe that's a place where your voice is needed. In your classroom, which you control, begin to talk in richer ways about those things that impact us, both from our lived experience, but also from the context in which we operate, right? Just start to introduce it. You might not have all the answers. It might feel awkward and uncomfortable, but if you do it from an authentic space, then what you get is actually what diversity actually promises. And that's a richness that starts to pay dividends. Because now we begin to break down these walls that we have artificially between many of us. And then real learning can begin at that point. Real engagement, real trust, real relationships can begin at that point. So it may sound Pollyannish or, sort of a bit abstract, but quite honestly, at the essence of it, is that once we create an environment where this work is seen as integral to who we are, then our opportunity to then harness it, to have some tangible impacts and outcomes is increased exponentially. If we don't get out of the box of diversity being stuff for the other folk or stuff that don't involve me, then what we'll always get is an inept, half-hearted attempt to move this organization forward.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share where we've been, where we are now, and where we're headed, and how to engage and activate in this space. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris.
Thank you so much.
Whether you're on the go or just need a quick break, we hope that these insights into the faculty at VCU School of Medicine will empower and inspire you to teach, lead, discover, advance, and serve with excellence. For more information on the resources mentioned in this episode, please check out the links provided in the episode description. See you soon.